Hi guys, this is George back here with another video and welcome to part 2 of discussing the cancelled rides and attractions of Alton Towers, the UK's biggest theme park. If you haven't seen it already, then I definitely recommend checking out episode 1 where we talk about some of the older projects, and today we're going to be talking about some of the more recent projects that just for a variety of reasons didn't end up happening, and there's certainly a lot to talk about, so let's get straight into it. So as we all know, Alton Towers do have some issues when it comes to planning permission, with a situation being building above the tree line, which Alton Towers are not allowed to do. So they have very creative ways to build their rides, but making sure they're below the tree level. However, in 2003 there were plans for not only an attraction that would go a bit over the tree line, but thousands of feet over the tree line. Alton Towers had plans to put in a hot air balloon in 2003, which would have been a very unique attraction to have here in the UK. Of course, we can look at something like Panoramagique at Disneyland Paris, where you just get in the hot air balloon and it takes you up into the sky and you could admire all the views. It would have been fantastic seeing the views of Alton Towers from thousands of feet in the air. However, yeah, I don't think the locals would have appreciated it too much. There's not too much information on this, however, we do know that there were plans for this, but it was in the end scrapped. So around 2006 there were plans for a project codenamed Project Dolphin, and this was going to be located in Coaster Corner. At the moment there's nothing there, but this site has been home to many different coasters over the years, hence why it's got the nickname Coaster Corner. Most recently, Project Horizon was planned to be built on that site. However, of course, we haven't heard too much about Project Horizon for a while, apart from in the last couple of weeks. I was going to mention it in this video because someone had told me, a source of mine had told me that it had been cancelled. However, as of the last couple of weeks, it seems like it's back on the table now, so it'll be certainly very interesting to see what happens with that. But Project Dolphin was basically going to be the UK's answer to Discovery Cove. So you may have heard of Discovery Cove. It's owned by SeaWorld, and you've got one in Orlando. So basically you can go there. It's like a marine centre, so you can go and swim with dolphins and all these other kinds of sea life. It looks really cool. I'd really like to go and experience it at some point, where you get to swim with all these different animals. It looks amazing, like an amazing overall experience. And yeah, this was originally something that was planned for Alton Towers. However, this didn't end up happening. I'm not sure why. There's not too much information on this, however it was cancelled. So in 2008, Alton Towers wanted to re-theme one of their existing areas, and the two areas specifically they were looking at were, at the time, Ugland and also X Sector. However, it was chosen that Ugland would be rethemed into Dark Forest, and of course with this retheme they wanted to put in a significant new roller coaster, which of course ended up being 13. However, before 13 there were plans for a lot of other different rides to be located here. There were plans for a Vekoma tilt coaster to be on this site, as well as that a Vekoma switchback coaster. As well as that, there was also plans for a vertical launch roller coaster, potentially manufactured by Sierra, and there was also plans for a Vekoma thrill glider. Yes, the thrill glider was still a thing in the plans at this time. We're finally actually seeing some getting built now. One's opening at Six Flags Magic Mountain in 2027. However, yeah, there was plans for one of these back in 2008 at Alton Towers, kind of like a mix between a Vekoma booster bike and also a standard flying coaster. So that would have been really interesting to see. As well as that, before they decided what area they wanted to retheme, if they had chosen X Sector to be rethemed, there was plans for dueling Dead Stars to be located in this area. So yeah, a pair of these flat rides that spin round upside down and spin round in a circle. They look really unique. They certainly don't look very comfortable. However, it would have been a very unique ride to have at the park. But yeah, that was originally planned for X Sector if they wanted to retheme that. But yes, they did decide to retheme Ugland into Dark Forest. And yes, all of the coaster types that I mentioned previously were cancelled in favour of 13, which ended up being Secret Weapon 6 and the first roller coaster to feature a vertical drop track. So much like with Project Dolphin, not too much is known about the next attraction that I'm going to talk about, but it is another wooden coaster. There are a lot of wooden coasters planned for Alton Towers, and more will be coming up later. However, in 2009, supposedly, there's not too much information about this. Sources suggest that this could have been a different year. Like people, I've heard a lot of different things, but 2009 seems to be the most likely. There were plans for a wooden coaster to be located at the park themed to Wallace and Gromit. Yes, an iconic British TV show. Of course, you've got Wallace and Gromit Thrill-O-Matic at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. However, originally there were plans for a Wallace and Gromit themed wooden coaster at Alton Towers, which I honestly didn't believe it when I first saw it. However, this is actually a thing that's been spoken about even by the designer of a lot of the rides at Alton Towers, John Wardley. He has publicly spoken about this Wallace and Gromit wooden coaster, which is crazy to think that that could have been built at Alton Towers. But yeah, other than the fact that it was planned for 2009, supposedly there's not too much information on this coaster. So in 2013, there were plans for a roller coaster to be located in Katanga Canyon. Again, not too much information is known about this coaster. However, there was originally talks of a stand-up coaster being in Katanga Canyon, most likely manufactured by B&M. Of course, a lot of these have been built out in the States. Quite a lot of them have been converted into floorless coasters since opening, but these were really popular in the 90s. However, yeah, over time, they've become not so popular. A lot of parks have opted to convert them into sit-down coasters. A lot of parks opted to just close them down for good. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the last few. But of course, in the last couple of years, B&M have kind of remade the stand-up coaster with the surf coaster. They've made their newer modern-day surf coaster, which is their new stand-up coaster, which is actually a really fun ride. However, this would have most likely been an original stand-up coaster from B&M. But yeah, other than that, not too much is known about this coaster. However, it's certainly interesting to think that there could have been a B&M stand-up coaster at Alton Towers. It would have been interesting to see what they would have done with it as well, with the fact that they can't build over the tree height. So I would have been really interested to see this, but I couldn't find any plans for this. So in 2018, Alton Towers planned for an expansion of the Enchanted Village. Of course, one of their accommodation options that has lots of different lodges around that you can stay in. There was originally plans in 2018 for an expansion of this to feature some smaller pods around the area. However, this ended up being cancelled. It was cancelled as part of the Enchanted Village. However, it did end up opening in 2019 as the Stargazing Pods. So this is a separate kind of accommodation option at the park now. However, originally there were plans for these to be merged together and for the Stargazing Pods to be an expansion of the Enchanted Village. However, in 2019 they opened as their own standalone accommodation option, and you can see some plans for what this would have looked like if it was going to be part of the Enchanted Village expansion. So we're now going to talk about another wooden coaster. So before Wicker Man was built, there were plans for many different wooden coasters in the park, and I'm going to talk about more of them in the next segment. However, this one I'm going to talk about separately because we know a bit more information about this one. We have some plans for it, and yes, there was originally plans for a wooden coaster to be located in Forbidden Valley, and instead of being manufactured by GCI, which was the manufacturer they went for Wicker Man, this was going to be manufactured by Gravity Group. So Gravity Group is quite a polarising manufacturer. A lot of people like the coasters, however their train design a lot of people find a bit uncomfortable, myself included. Some of their rides can be a bit rough because of the Timberliner trains, and the lap bars are pretty uncomfortable. They're not the best restraints on roller coasters. However, yeah, there were plans for a Gravity Group wooden coaster to be located in Forbidden Valley, kind of towards where the Blade is and also where Toxicator is now. There were plans for a wooden coaster to go kind of between where both of those attractions are, if the Blade was still standing, of course. And we can see some plans for this wooden coaster here as well, that you can see. So yeah, Gravity Group wooden coaster. Doesn't look like the most exciting layout, but therefore eventually it ended up being scrapped in favour of Wicker Man. So these next attractions, not very much is known about them. However, I still wanted to talk about them because there has still been discussion about these rides actually being planned. A lot of these are wooden coasters that have been spoken about by John Wardley, of course the designer of a lot of rides at Alton Towers. So it's interesting to look back on what could have been. So yeah, of course I've spoken about the fact that there are a lot of wooden coasters planned. Here we go, this is where it comes up. So there was originally plans for a wooden coaster to be themed to a spooky circus. That was a potential theme for a wooden coaster at some point in the park's history. There's also been plans for a wooden coaster to be located on the old site of 1001 Nights. The flat ride that used to be at the park, there was plans for a wooden coaster to go there. There was also plans for a wooden coaster to be located next to the towers, which would have offered some great views of the towers themselves. However, yeah, this ended up being cancelled. In terms of other attractions, there was also plans for an expansion of the Alton Towers water park. This opened in 2003 as part of the Splash Landings Hotel, and it's never really been expanded on over the years. However, there were originally plans to expand it, but for whatever reason, these never ended up happening. I couldn't find a lot of information about these projects, but I'm still mentioning them just because I have heard about these before. There have been rumours going around about some of these projects, and of course John Wardley has openly discussed some of these projects as well, such as the wooden coasters. As well as that, there was also plans for a robo-arm attraction to be located inside the old Black Hole tent. Of course, before the Smiler, Black Hole used to be located on that site, and it was an indoor coaster inside a tent, and the plan was to originally remove the coaster and put some robo-arms in there, create a robo-arm attraction in there, which you can see by these plans. It's unknown when this would have happened, obviously at some point before the Smiler opened. However, this was originally a consideration for this plot of land. And there was also plans to have a retheme of Cred Street. However, this ended up being completely overshadowed by the opening of Rita in 2005. However, again, not very much information is known about that. But there we go. That is all the attractions that I've managed to find out any information about of cancelled attractions at Alton Towers. Let me know what you think. Have you heard of all these rides? Let me know what you think about these rides. Are you glad that they got cancelled? Would you have liked to see these rides get built? It would have certainly been very different if these attractions had been built. I mean, there would have been no Wicker Man if one of the other wooden coasters had been built, a stand-up coaster potentially being built, Project Dolphin, and of course check back on the last episode as well where I talk about even more of the cancelled attractions at Alton Towers. But there we go, that's now the end of this video here. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to follow me on Instagram at George Kelly and follow me on Twitter at George Kelly. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe everyone, and I will see you all later. Bye!